Sometimes the ones the world forgets are only waiting for someone loyal enough to come back for them. Snow fell quietly across the small Oregon coastal town, covering sidewalks, rooftops, and empty parking lots beneath a pale gray sky that seemed too tired to brighten. Winter had settled heavily this year, colder than usual, with sharp winds blowing in from the ocean hard enough to make people walk faster, speak less, and hurry home before dark. Ethan Hayes pulled the collar of his faded military jacket higher against the cold as he stepped carefully across the icy sidewalk near Harbor Pines Nursing Center. Beside him walked Titan, a massive German shepherd with thick sable fur dusted white by snow, ears raised sharply against the wind, steady amber eyes watching everything around them with quiet patience. Every Thursday afternoon, Ethan volunteered nearby, fixing small repairs for people who could not afford help. Loose railings, broken heaters, stuck doors, the kind of work nobody noticed until winter arrived, and suddenly everything mattered again. Harbor Pines stood at the edge of town, overlooking frozen marshland near the water. The building itself looked tired. Not abandoned exactly, just forgotten somehow. Like too many years had passed without anyone stopping to ask if the people inside were still doing all right. Ethan had never liked the place much. Something about it felt cold beyond the weather. Staff changed often. Windows stayed shut. Residents rarely sat outside anymore, even during warmer months. Still, he tried not to judge too quickly. Life had taught him enough about appearances. Titan suddenly stopped walking. Completely stopped. Ethan almost stumbled when the leash tightened unexpectedly. "Come on, buddy," he said quietly, rubbing cold hands together. "We are heading home." But Titan did not move. The giant shepherd stood frozen in place, staring hard toward the rear parking area behind Harbor Pines. Snow blew gently across the pavement, while distant wind rattled an old metal fence near the loading entrance. Ethan frowned. "Titan." No response. The dog's posture changed. Ears higher. Body tense. Focus absolute. Then without warning, Titan pulled hard and broke into motion. Ethan barely caught the leash before the dog rushed across the icy lot toward the back service road behind the building. "Titan," Ethan called, surprised. "Slow down." The shepherd ignored him. That alone felt strange. Titan had military obedience training and almost never pulled. Especially not like this. Snow crunched beneath Ethan's boots as he followed, breathing harder in the cold. Behind Harbor Pines sat an older parking area near the supply dock where broken equipment and unused vehicles gathered beneath winter weather. Most people never walked back there. Too isolated. Too quiet. Titan stopped suddenly near a small shuttle van half covered in snow. The vehicle looked old and forgotten, parked crooked beside a fence where snowdrifts had nearly buried the tires. The engine was off. No lights. Windows fogged strangely from the inside. Titan moved closer immediately and began scratching softly at the passenger door. Then something happened that made Ethan stop cold. A weak sound, barely noticeable. Knock. Then another. Faint. Slow. Coming from inside the van. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. "Hello," he called out, stepping closer. Snow drifted across his shoulders while wind moved through the empty parking lot. Another knock. Weak this time. Ethan wiped frost from the passenger window with his sleeve. What he saw nearly stopped his breath. Inside sat 4 elderly residents wrapped in thin blankets. One older man leaned asleep against the glass. A woman with silver hair sat trembling quietly in her wheelchair, hands shaking beneath a worn cardigan. Another elderly woman stared blankly toward the windshield as though she had stopped expecting help hours ago. Near the back sat an older woman with gentle eyes and soft white curls tucked beneath a knitted hat, trying unsuccessfully to comfort the others despite trembling herself. Titan let out one quiet sound low in his chest and moved immediately toward her side of the van, tail low, concern written clearly in every movement. Ethan yanked open the door. Cold air rushed out. No heater, no warmth, only stale air and silence. "Good Lord," Ethan whispered. "How long have you all been out here?" The woman nearest him blinked slowly before answering in a voice almost too soft to hear. "They said someone was coming back," she said carefully. "But it is getting dark now." Ethan looked around the empty parking lot. No staff, no movement, just falling snow. The woman near the back reached carefully toward Titan, whose head now rested gently near her knee. The shepherd stood perfectly still, calm and patient as though he had known exactly who needed him. Her trembling hand touched his fur softly. "He came back," she whispered with watery eyes. At least somebody did. Ethan felt something heavy settle quietly in his chest. The kind of feeling he recognized from years ago. The moment before anger became responsibility. He looked back toward the nursing home building where warm lights glowed safely behind closed windows, while snow continued falling harder across the parking lot. Then he looked again at the people inside the freezing van. Titan did not move, did not leave, and somehow Ethan already knew neither of them would be walking away tonight. Snow kept falling across Harbor Pines Nursing Center as evening slowly settled over the Oregon coast, covering sidewalks and empty benches beneath a sky that looked colder by the minute. The shuttle van sat forgotten behind the building near the loading dock, while weak wind rattled an old chain-link fence nearby. Ethan Hayes stood beside the open passenger door, cold air stinging his face as he looked between the elderly residents inside and the brightly lit nursing home only 50 yards away. The distance somehow made everything worse. Warmth sat so close, yet nobody had come. Titan remained beside the older woman near the back seat, resting quietly near her wheelchair while she gently stroked the thick fur along his neck with trembling fingers. The giant German shepherd barely moved, calm and steady like he understood something people often forgot. Sometimes comfort mattered more than words. Ethan crouched slightly near the van entrance. "I am Ethan," he said softly. "Can somebody tell me how long you all have been out here?" The older man nearest the door rubbed stiff hands together beneath a thin blanket. "Since lunch," he answered after a pause. "They said transportation got delayed." Ethan looked toward the darkening sky. Lunch had passed nearly 5 hours ago. Temperature had already dropped below freezing. He forced himself to stay calm. Anger solved very little when people needed help first. "Has anyone checked on you?" he asked carefully. Silence answered him. Then the woman near Titan finally spoke. "Only him," she whispered gently, looking down at the shepherd. Her voice carried the softness of someone who had spent too many years learning disappointment quietly. "He found us." Ethan nodded once, swallowing hard against the feeling building in his chest. He had seen neglect before. Different forms, different places. But loneliness always looked the same. Before we keep going, take a moment to like and subscribe so you do not miss more emotional stories like this, because sometimes the quietest acts of loyalty leave the deepest mark. Ethan pulled off one glove and reached carefully for his phone. He called Harbor Pines immediately. After several rings, a tired receptionist answered. "Harbor Pines." Ethan kept his voice even. "There are 4 residents freezing in a shuttle van behind your building." Silence. Then papers shifting. "Sir, transportation arrangements are being handled." Ethan looked back inside the van. One woman had started shivering harder now. "Handled," he repeated quietly. "It is below freezing out here." "We are short-staffed," the voice replied flatly. "Someone should be with them shortly." Ethan stared toward the building windows glowing warmly in the distance. Somebody should be. The words settled wrong. Too practiced. Too easy. "No," Ethan said firmly. "Somebody should have been here already." He hung up before frustration made him say more than necessary. Titan suddenly stood and turned his head sharply toward the nursing home building. Ears raised. Focused again. Then the shepherd looked back toward Ethan as though waiting. Ethan recognized that look. Military dogs learned patterns. They noticed what people missed. Titan was trying to say something without words. Ethan removed the heavy wool blanket from his own truck parked nearby and carefully covered the older residents one by one. "We are going to warm this place up," he said gently. "Nobody is staying cold tonight." The older woman nearest Titan smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who means that." Ethan offered a tired smile. "I usually do." Her name, he soon learned, was Margaret Bell, 82 years old, former piano teacher, widowed nearly 15 years. No close family nearby anymore. Yet despite everything, she still spoke softly to the others, asking if they were all right before thinking of herself. Titan refused to leave her side. Ethan noticed how the shepherd leaned gently against Margaret whenever cold wind slipped through the cracked door. Protective somehow. Familiar. Like loyalty, remembered things people forgot. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. No staff came. Snow grew heavier. Harbor Pines remained warm and glowing behind untouched windows. Finally, Ethan walked toward the rear entrance himself. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly while a television played somewhere down the hall. At the front desk sat a woman scrolling through paperwork without urgency. She barely looked up. "Can I help you?" Ethan rested both hands against the counter. Calm voice. Controlled tone. "4 elderly residents are freezing behind your building." The woman sighed softly. "Sir, we are aware of the relocation issue." Ethan frowned slightly. Relocation issue. Not people. Not residents. Not human beings. Just issue. "You left them in a van," he said quietly. "In this weather." Before she answered, Titan suddenly stepped closer to Ethan and let out one low sound deep in his chest. Not aggressive. Alert. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. Then Ethan noticed something strange. A clipboard sitting partly hidden near the desk. Names listed. Times checked off. One word circled in red ink beside several residents. Transfer delayed. Including Margaret Bell. Ethan stared at it for a long second, while something colder than snow settled quietly inside him. Because now this no longer felt like a mistake. And outside, somewhere beyond the windows, Titan turned his head slowly toward a dark storage building near the back lot, as though he already knew the night was about to become much stranger. Snow covered the parking lot behind Harbor Pines Nursing Center in a soft white layer that looked peaceful from a distance, though nothing about the evening felt peaceful anymore. Wind moved harder now, carrying the sharp cold of the Oregon coast through the narrow spaces between buildings while snowflakes drifted lazily beneath yellow parking lot lights. Ethan Hayes stood near the reception desk inside the nursing home, one hand resting quietly against the counter as his eyes stayed fixed on the clipboard listing names marked with red circles. Margaret Bell, Arthur Simmons, Evelyn Moore, Thomas Reed. Besides several names sat the same cold phrase written neatly in ink. Transfer delayed. Not concern, not explanation, just delay, like forgotten luggage waiting in storage. Ethan slowly looked up at the receptionist. "How long have they been out there?" he asked quietly. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Sir, transportation issues happen sometimes." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Calm. Stay calm." Years in the military had taught him anger solved very little when people still needed protecting. "They are elderly," he said carefully. "It is freezing outside." Before she answered, Titan suddenly stepped away from Ethan and turned sharply toward the hallway leading deeper into the building. Ears raised. Focused. Then without warning, the giant German shepherd started walking. Purposefully. Not wandering. Not distracted. Moving like he had already decided something important waited elsewhere. Ethan frowned immediately. "Titan." The shepherd paused briefly, looking back once before continuing toward the rear hallway. That alone unsettled Ethan. Titan rarely ignored commands unless something truly mattered. "Excuse me," Ethan said quietly to the receptionist before following. Hallway lights hummed softly overhead. The smell of old carpet cleaner mixed with reheated cafeteria food drifted faintly through the building. Doors lined both sides of the corridor. Some closed, some partially open. A television played softly from one room, while distant coughing echoed somewhere deeper inside. Yet something felt strange. Too quiet. Too empty. Titan stopped near a side exit leading toward the rear maintenance area of the nursing home. Outside the small glass window beside the door sat an old detached storage building half buried beneath snowdrifts. No lights. No footprints except older tracks nearly hidden beneath fresh snowfall. The shepherd stood perfectly still, staring hard toward it, then lowered his nose near the floor. One step forward. Pause. Another step. Ethan noticed immediately. Titan was following scent. Slowly. Carefully. Like something familiar lingered there. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan asked softly. Titan let out one low sound deep in his chest before nudging lightly against the door. Ethan glanced back toward the main hallway. Nobody watching. Nobody checking on the residents outside. Nobody asking questions. Strange. Too strange. He pushed the door open carefully. Cold wind greeted them instantly. Snow crunched beneath boots as they crossed toward the storage building behind Harbor Pines. The farther they walked, the quieter everything became. Even the nursing home behind them seemed distant now, warm windows glowing softly against falling snow like another world entirely. Titan reached the building first, then stopped near one side where snow had gathered against a rusted metal wall. Suddenly, the shepherd began pawing gently at the ground. Not frantic. Intentional. Ethan crouched beside him. Half buried beneath snow sat an old stack of cardboard boxes protected by warped plastic tarp. Forgotten. Hidden almost. Ethan brushed snow away carefully. One box had partially collapsed from moisture. Papers spilled loosely inside. Medical forms. Resident transfer sheets. Expense reports. Ethan frowned. Why leave this outside? He pulled one folded document free. His stomach tightened immediately. Several resident names appeared on the list, including Margaret Bell. Beside her file sat handwritten notes. Family unavailable. Low priority transfer. Ethan read it twice. Then a third time. Surely not. Nearby Titan moved again, nose tracing carefully toward the storage door itself, scratching once softly against weathered metal. Ethan stood slowly and tried the handle. Locked. Yet one corner of the old building showed something strange. Fresh scrape marks in snow. Recent movement. Somebody had been here recently. Titan stepped back slightly, watching Ethan with steady amber eyes. Waiting again, like he knew something sat just beyond reach. Then Ethan heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned quickly. Margaret Bell stood several yards away near the nursing home exit, wrapped in a thin blanket, snow gathering softly on her shoulders. Ethan walked toward her immediately. "Margaret," he said gently, "you should not be outside in this cold." She looked toward the storage building quietly before speaking. "That dog keeps coming here," she whispered softly. Titan walked over immediately and stood beside her, calm as ever. Margaret reached down and rested one trembling hand against his fur. "There used to be another wing," she said after a pause. "Before they closed it." Ethan frowned. "Closed it?" She nodded slowly. "Some people disappeared after that." Wind moved softly between them while snow continued falling around the dark storage building. Margaret's eyes stayed fixed somewhere far away now. Quiet memory. Quiet fear. Then she whispered words that settled heavily in Ethan's chest. "People kept saying someone would come back for us." Titan looked once more toward the locked building. Completely still. Completely certain. And for the first time that night, Ethan stopped wondering if something was wrong here. Because deep down, he already knew something was. Snow continued falling over Harbor Pines Nursing Center as the evening deepened into something colder and quieter, the kind of winter darkness that made everything feel farther away than it really was. The old storage building behind the nursing home stood motionless beneath layers of snow, while pale yellow lights from the main building barely reached the back lot anymore. Ethan Hayes stood beside Margaret Bell near the frozen walkway, hands buried deep inside his faded military jacket, while Titan remained alert beside them, amber eyes fixed steadily toward the locked storage door as though waiting for permission to keep searching. Margaret pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. Even beneath the weak outdoor light, Ethan could see exhaustion in her face. Not only tiredness, something older, the kind that came from disappointment repeated too many times. "You should be inside," Ethan said gently. "You are freezing." Margaret smiled softly in that way older people sometimes smiled when they no longer expected much from the world. "Cold does not bother you as much after enough lonely winters," she said quietly. Ethan looked toward Harbor Pines. Warm light glowed through windows where staff walked calmly through hallways carrying coffee and paperwork. From here the building almost looked comforting. Safe even. Yet behind it sat forgotten residents inside a freezing shuttle van. Something did not fit. Titan suddenly moved closer to Margaret and gently leaned against her leg. The shepherd had attached himself to her somehow. Quietly. Naturally. Like he sensed something fragile hiding beneath her soft voice. Margaret rested trembling fingers against his neck. "He reminds me of someone," she whispered. Ethan looked down at Titan. "Someone you knew?" She nodded slowly. "My husband had a German shepherd after the war." Her voice softened further. "Dogs remember when people stop paying attention." The sentence settled heavily in the cold air. Ethan had no answer for that, because deep down he suspected she might be right. Before he could speak again, the rear nursing home door suddenly opened hard against the wind. A woman in a long navy coat stepped outside, carrying frustration across her face like she had worn it for years. Mid-50s. Sharp posture. Tired eyes hidden behind professionalism. "Margaret," she called firmly. "You were supposed to be inside." Margaret's hand tightened slightly against Titan's fur. The woman approached quickly before stopping when she noticed Ethan standing there. Her eyes dropped immediately to the shepherd. "Sir," she said carefully, voice polite but strained. Animals are not allowed near residents. Ethan remained calm. He found them. She frowned slightly. Excuse me. Ethan looked toward the shuttle van still sitting near the loading dock beneath fresh snow. For elderly residents freezing inside your van. The woman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise. Recognition. Like she already knew. I am Director Susan Miller, she said after a pause. We had an unexpected transportation delay. Ethan studied her quietly. Same phrase again. Transportation delay. They have been outside for hours, he said softly. No heater. No staff. Susan folded both arms against the cold. We are understaffed and managing a difficult transition. Ethan glanced once toward Margaret. People are not boxes waiting in storage. For the first time, Susan looked slightly uncomfortable. Titan stood taller beside Ethan now. Not threatening. Protective. Calm but watching closely. Margaret lowered her eyes. Nobody came back, she whispered almost to herself. Susan sighed softly, avoiding her gaze. Margaret, please go inside. But Margaret did not move. Instead, she looked quietly toward the dark storage building behind them. What happened to the West Wing? She asked suddenly. Silence followed. Wind moved harder across the back lot. Snow drifted between them. Susan's face tightened slightly. That wing was permanently closed. Margaret frowned faintly. Some people disappeared after that. Susan immediately straightened. Residents were transferred. Ethan noticed something shift in her tone. Too quick. Too rehearsed. Titan suddenly turned sharply toward the storage building again. Ears raised. Alert. Then without warning, the shepherd pulled gently toward it. Nose lowered against fresh snow near the locked entrance. Ethan frowned. Titan. The dog scratched softly once against the metal door. Then again. Susan's expression changed instantly. Stay away from there, she said too quickly. Too sharply. Ethan looked back at her. Why? Storage area, she answered immediately. Private records. Ethan stepped closer to the building, boots crunching softly in fresh snow. Titan had already moved toward the sidewall where snow covered several stacked containers half hidden beneath tarp. Then the shepherd stopped again, nose pressed low near the frozen ground. Focus absolute. Ethan crouched beside him. Something barely visible sat beneath loose snow near the wall. A rusted metal filing cabinet drawer left half exposed. Strange place to leave records. Susan stepped forward faster now. Sir, she said firmly, I need you to leave the property. Ethan slowly stood. Calm. Controlled. But something colder than the weather had settled inside him now. Military instinct. The feeling that people were hiding something they hoped nobody would question. Behind him, Margaret whispered softly, voice almost carried away by the wind. Sometimes, she said quietly, people disappear when nobody thinks anyone will come looking. Titan remained perfectly still beside the buried cabinet drawer, refusing to move. And somehow Ethan already knew this night was no longer about helping stranded residents. Because buried beneath Harbor Pines, something else had been forgotten too. Snow piled deeper across Harbor Pines Nursing Center, while cold wind moved steadily through the back lot, turning every sound softer beneath winter darkness. The storage building stood motionless beneath yellow security lights, half hidden behind drifting snow as though time itself had stopped visiting that corner of the property years ago. Ethan Hayes remained beside the rusted filing drawer partially buried near the wall, eyes narrowed slightly, while Titan stood watch beside him. Unmoving, ears raised toward the building like something invisible still held his attention. Margaret Bell lingered several feet behind, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the weather, shoulders trembling softly beneath falling snow. Director Susan Miller crossed her arms tightly against the cold. Professional calm remained on her face, but something underneath had started to crack. Ethan had seen it before. The look people carried when truth stood too close. I asked you to leave, Susan said firmly. Ethan stayed calm. And I asked why elderly residents were freezing in a van. Neither raised their voice. They did not need to. Sometimes silence carried enough weight all by itself. Titan suddenly lowered his nose toward the half-buried filing drawer again and nudged it gently. Snow shifted loose around the edges. Ethan crouched carefully. The metal had rusted badly, but one side remained partly open where age had warped the lock. Inside sat damp folders pressed tightly together beneath frost damage. Ethan pulled one loose carefully. Resident records. Old transfer paperwork. Dates going back several years. Strange thing was, Many names carried handwritten notes nearly identical to those he saw earlier. No family contact. Priority low. Transfer pending. Delayed. Again and again. Ethan frowned. What exactly happened here? Susan stepped forward immediately. Those records are private. Then why are they outside in the snow? Ethan asked quietly. Susan hesitated. Just long enough. Behind them, Margaret shifted uneasily. That used to belong to the West Wing, she whispered softly. Wind carried her words almost away. Ethan turned toward her gently. Tell me about the West Wing. Margaret looked toward Harbor Pines, eyes resting on warm, glowing windows far beyond the parking lot. They closed it after staffing changed, she said slowly. Said there were not enough resources. Her voice grew softer. People started leaving. Ethan glanced back at the records in his hand. Transferred. Margaret hesitated, then shook her head once. Maybe. Titan walked immediately to her side again, pressing gently against her leg, as though sensing fear before words could explain it. Margaret rested trembling fingers against his fur. Some residents waited weeks, she continued quietly. Sometimes they packed bags because somebody promised transportation. Her voice shook now. Then nobody came. Snow moved sideways in sudden wind. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed faintly against the Oregon shoreline. Ethan looked back toward Susan. Did families know? Susan rubbed cold hands together, expression hardening again. You are making assumptions. Am I? Ethan held up the frozen paperwork. Because this looks like people being forgotten. Susan looked exhausted suddenly. Older somehow beneath the parking lot lights. You do not understand what this place costs, she said quietly. Funding disappeared. Staff left. Families stopped visiting. She paused. Sometimes people get stuck. Margaret lowered her eyes. People are not packages, she whispered softly. The sentence lingered there between falling snow and winter silence. Ethan looked toward the shuttle van again, where 4 elderly residents still waited in cold darkness. No, he said quietly. They are not. Titan suddenly stiffened beside him, completely still, then turned sharply toward the side of the storage building again. Nose lowered. One step. Pause. Another. Ethan followed immediately. Near the back wall beneath fresh snow sat something else partially hidden beside stacked crates. A cardboard box wrapped hastily beneath plastic sheeting, newer than the filing drawer. Titan pawed gently near it. Ethan crouched again. Inside sat blankets, medication containers, several sealed resident folders marked for transfer. One envelope sat on top in red marker. Waiting list. Ethan opened it slowly. Names, dates, comments beside residents. Family unavailable. High medical cost. Limited mobility. Low priority relocation. Margaret Bell appeared near the middle of the list. Ethan's stomach tightened. Margaret stepped closer carefully. What is it? He hesitated before answering. Looks like someone made decisions about who mattered first. Margaret stood very still after that. Her eyes filled quietly with sadness older than anger. Nobody visits me anymore, she whispered. I guess that makes things easier. Titan leaned harder against her side immediately, tail still, patient eyes watching her face. Ethan looked down at the shepherd for a moment. Somehow dogs always understood grief before people admitted it existed. Then he noticed something else tucked beneath the paperwork. A faded photograph. 5 elderly residents standing together near Harbor Pines years earlier. Smiling. Laughing. Margaret younger somehow. Beside the image sat handwritten words on the back. We promised nobody gets left behind. Ethan stared quietly at the sentence while cold wind moved around them. Former Navy training echoed somewhere deep inside memory. Loyalty mattered. Always had. Leave no one behind. Not there. Not anywhere. Susan finally spoke again, quieter now. You should go home. Ethan looked up slowly. Snow gathered across his shoulders while Harbor Pines glowed warmly behind them. Then he glanced once toward Margaret, still standing in cold silence beside Titan. I do not think they need somebody leaving tonight, he said softly. And for the first time since this strange evening began, Susan Miller had no answer. Snow kept falling through the night over Harbor Pines Nursing Center, covering the frozen parking lot in quiet white silence, while cold wind swept across the Oregon coast with the steady sound of distant waves somewhere beyond the dark hills. Near the rear entrance of the nursing home, Ethan Hayes stood beside Margaret Bell and the forgotten stack of resident files, his breath rising slowly into cold air while Titan remained close, alert but calm, pressed gently against Margaret, as though the shepherd understood she had spent too many years standing alone. Harbor pines glowed warmly behind them. Bright windows, heated hallways, soft television sounds drifting faintly through glass. Yet somehow the coldest place on the property sat closest to the people who needed warmth most. Ethan looked down once more at the waiting list inside the weathered envelope. Margaret Bell, Arthur Simmons, Evelyn Moore, Thomas Reed. Beside nearly every name sat careful notes written in handwriting too neat for something so painful. Limited family contact. High care cost. Transfer pending. Low priority. Ethan folded the papers carefully and exhaled slowly. Military life had taught him systems failed sometimes. But this felt different. Not failure. Convenience. The kind that happened when lonely people became invisible long enough. Susan Miller stood quietly nearby, arms crossed tightly against the cold. Her posture remained defensive, though exhaustion had started replacing frustration. "You still do not understand," she said after several seconds. "We lost funding. Staff quit. Families disappeared." Ethan looked toward the shuttle van still buried beneath snow near the loading dock. "So they wait in freezing vans." Susan lowered her eyes briefly. "Nobody wanted this." Margaret spoke softly before Ethan could answer. Nobody stopped it either. Silence settled around them. Even Susan had nothing ready for that. Titan suddenly turned toward the nursing home entrance again, ears raised, watching. Then slowly he walked several steps toward the door before glancing back at Ethan. Waiting. Ethan understood immediately. The shepherd wanted him moving, wanted him doing something. Ethan had trusted dogs before, enough to know when instinct mattered. "Margaret," he said gently, "how many residents are still here tonight?" She thought quietly for a moment. "Maybe 20. Her voice softened. "Many do not have visitors anymore." Ethan nodded once. "Then nobody stays cold tonight." Margaret looked surprised. Susan frowned slightly. "What exactly are you planning?" Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Something simple. 20 minutes later, Harbor Pines parking lot looked different. Not dramatic, just human. Ethan made calls. First to Pastor Samuel from the small church near the marina. Then to Miguel Alvarez, owner of the local seafood diner, who always stayed open too late. Then to Nancy Cooper, who ran the community center food pantry. Ethan rarely asked anybody for help. Pride made lonely people quiet. But sometimes caring about others mattered more than pride. Snow still drifted softly when the first truck arrived carrying blankets. Then hot soup. Space heaters. Warm coats. Nothing fancy. Just people showing up because somebody asked. Miguel climbed out carrying steaming containers of chowder beneath both arms. "You serious?" he asked Ethan quietly while looking toward the van. Ethan nodded. Miguel shook his head once. "That is messed up." Soon church volunteers arrived carrying thermoses of coffee and tea. Someone brought gloves. Someone else brought warm socks. A retired nurse named Helen quietly checked blood pressure and medication concerns for several residents without asking for attention. Nobody argued politics. Nobody made speeches. People simply helped. The way communities sometimes remembered themselves after forgetting for too long. Titan moved calmly between residents the entire evening, sitting beside wheelchairs, resting quietly near trembling hands, letting strangers pet thick sable fur when fear grew too heavy for words. Somehow the shepherd became a kind of comfort nobody expected. Arthur Simmons, who barely spoke earlier, finally smiled faintly while scratching behind Titan's ears. "Best nurse this place ever had," he whispered softly. Margaret laughed quietly for the first time all evening. Small sound, but warm somehow. Ethan noticed it immediately. Susan stood near the entrance watching everything unfold in silence. Volunteers moving through snow. Blankets wrapped around shoulders. Hot meals handed gently to forgotten residents. No cameras. No praise. Just ordinary kindness arriving late, but arriving anyway. Eventually she walked toward Ethan. "I did not think anybody would come," she admitted quietly. Ethan looked toward Margaret speaking softly with church volunteers. "Most people help when they know somebody is hurting," he said. "Problem is nobody told them." Susan lowered her gaze again. "I tried keeping this place alive." Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe." Then after a pause. But somewhere along the way people stopped feeling like people. Wind softened slightly while snow drifted slower now. Titan suddenly stood near Margaret again, watching her carefully. Then the shepherd turned his attention toward the nursing home hallway beyond the glass doors. ears forward, still focused, still listening for something no one else heard. Margaret followed his gaze quietly. He keeps watching that old hallway, she whispered. Ethan frowned slightly. What hallway? Margaret hesitated, then answered softly enough that only he could hear. The West Wing. Her eyes moved toward darkened windows near the far side of the building where no lights glowed anymore. Nobody goes there now. Titan remained perfectly still, watching, waiting, like somehow the night had not finished telling its story yet. The storm softened sometime after midnight. The winter still held Harbor Pines Nursing Center beneath a cold silence that seemed to stretch endlessly across the Oregon coast. Snow rested thick against parked cars and frozen sidewalks while soft yellow lights glowed inside the building, warmer now somehow, because for the first time in a long while laughter had quietly returned. Residents who had spent the evening forgotten beneath blankets in a freezing shuttle van now sat inside, near portable heaters, wrapped in donated coats, while volunteers moved gently between chairs carrying soup, tea, and warm bread from Miguel's diner. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Sometimes kindness arrived late, but people held on to it harder when it finally showed up. Ethan Hayes stood near the hallway entrance holding a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, watching Margaret Bell laugh softly at something Arthur Simmons said from across the room. Titan lay stretched beside her chair, eyes half closed but never fully resting, always listening in that steady way working dogs seem to understand. Margaret scratched gently behind his ears. I think he knows more than most people, she whispered with a tired smile when Ethan approached. Ethan looked down at the shepherd. I stopped doubting him years ago. Titan suddenly lifted his head, completely alert, ears forward, watching again. Not the residents, not the volunteers, the hallway, specifically the darker side corridor leading toward the West Wing. Ethan followed the shepherd's stare. No lights glowed there, only darkness behind a faded wooden sign partially hidden near the ceiling. West Hall, closed access. Margaret noticed too. Her smile faded quietly. He keeps looking there, she said softly. He used to do that with Harold. Ethan frowned slightly. Harold? A resident, she answered after a pause. Kind man. Navy veteran. Her eyes drifted somewhere farther away. He disappeared after the wing closed. Ethan leaned quietly against the wall. Transferred. Margaret hesitated long enough to answer without answering. That is what they told us. Titan stood suddenly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. The shepherd walked directly toward the dark hallway and stopped at the chain blocking entrance access. Nose lifted, watching. Then one quiet sound escaped deep in his chest. Not fear. Recognition, almost. Ethan followed immediately. Snow still melted slowly from his boots as he crouched beside Titan near the blocked corridor. Dust gathered heavily near the floor. Nobody had walked here recently. Yet something felt wrong. A smell maybe. Old air mixed with stale heat and forgotten carpet. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. Susan Miller stood near the hallway entrance, shoulders heavy beneath her navy coat. She looked tired now, more human than defensive. That wing has been closed for almost 3 years, she said quietly. Ethan looked back at her. Why? Susan crossed her arms slowly. Budget cuts. Same answer. Same careful words. Ethan nodded once toward Titan. Then why does he keep coming back here? Susan said nothing for a moment. Wind tapped softly against nearby windows while distant volunteer voices echoed from the common room. Finally, she sighed. There were residents nobody claimed. Ethan stayed silent. Susan looked down. No visitors. No families answering calls. Her voice lowered. Sometimes facilities prioritize based on resources. Ethan felt something cold settle again beneath his ribs. Meaning? Susan hesitated. Meaning some residents got delayed longer than others. Titan moved suddenly. One sharp turn toward a side maintenance door, partly hidden along the closed hallway wall. Nose low again. Focus absolute. Ethan stood and approached carefully. Locked. But beneath the handle sat fresh scratches against dusty paint. Newer than the hallway itself. Strange. Titan pawed softly near the bottom corner once. Then twice. Susan looked uncomfortable immediately. That room is maintenance storage. Ethan glanced back. Same thing you said about the building outside. Silence answered him. Margaret slowly approached behind them wrapped in her donated blanket. Her voice sounded smaller now. Harold used to say nobody gets forgotten if somebody still remembers your name. Titan leaned harder against the door. Ethan tested the handle gently. Locked. Then his eyes caught something strange hanging near the frame. A faded clipboard tucked behind loose paneling. Almost hidden. He carefully pulled it loose. Inside sat handwritten records. Room assignments from years earlier. Names crossed out. Dates added. Transfer pending. Awaiting placement. Still waiting. One name near the bottom stopped him. Harold Jennings. Navy veteran. Status. Relocation unresolved. Ethan looked up slowly. Where did Harold go? Susan's expression changed again. Fear this time. Quiet fear. I honestly do not know, she admitted softly. After staff changes, records got messy. Titan lowered himself against the locked door and refused to move. Completely still. Watching. Waiting. Like somewhere beyond old walls and forgotten paperwork sat an answer nobody else had bothered to look for. Margaret rested trembling fingers against Ethan's arm. Do you think, she whispered carefully, some people are still waiting for somebody to come back? Ethan looked toward Titan, then the dark hallway stretching quietly into forgotten space. Outside snow continued falling gently over Harbor Pines while warm lights flickered through windows where lonely people had finally stopped feeling invisible for one night. Then Ethan answered softly, almost to himself. I think somebody should finally start looking. Morning arrived slowly over Harbor Pines Nursing Center beneath a pale winter sky, the kind of cold Oregon morning where fog lingered low over rooftops and the ocean wind carried silence farther than sound. Snow still rested against sidewalks and frozen shrubs, though inside the nursing home something had changed. Warm blankets covered shoulders. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Residents who had spent the previous evening forgotten inside a freezing shuttle van now sat near sunlight filtering gently through tall windows, speaking more than they had in weeks. Sometimes hope returned quietly, without announcing itself. Ethan Hayes had not gone home. He sat near the common room window wearing the same faded military jacket, hands wrapped around black coffee gone cold again, while Titan rested beside Margaret Bell's wheelchair, the giant German shepherd somehow becoming part guardian, part comfort, and part reminder that somebody still cared enough to stay. Margaret looked stronger this morning, though sadness still lived quietly behind her smile. He slept beside me, she whispered softly, scratching behind Titan's ears. Nobody has stayed near me through the night since my husband passed. Titan leaned gently against her chair without moving. Ethan smiled faintly. He chooses people, he said quietly. Margaret looked toward him thoughtfully. Maybe he chooses lonely ones. Before Ethan could answer, voices drifted from the hallway. Volunteers had started arriving again. Pastor Samuel brought warm breakfast sandwiches. Miguel carried fresh soup despite it barely being 9 in the morning. Helen returned to check medication schedules for residents who quietly admitted they had missed doses during recent staffing shortages. Somehow word had spread through town overnight. Not through outrage, through care. People simply showed up. Yet despite warmth returning to Harbor Pines, Titan remained restless. The shepherd kept lifting his head toward the west hallway, ears raising whenever silence settled too long. Watching, waiting, like unfinished business still lived somewhere behind locked doors. Ethan finally stood. Margaret, he said gently, would you mind showing me where Harold stayed? Her expression softened immediately. Room 114, she answered quietly. West Wing. Ethan nodded once. Titan stood instantly beside him before he even asked. The shepherd already knew where they were going. Together they walked toward the dark hallway again, where faded carpet stretched beneath dim ceiling lights. Dust lingered near corners untouched for too long. Somebody had closed this place physically, but emotionally it still felt occupied somehow. Not haunted, just forgotten. Titan stopped outside the locked maintenance door again and sat beside it without hesitation. Waiting. Ethan crouched carefully and studied the handle. Old lock. Weak frame. Nearby sat a maintenance cart tucked against the wall. Hanging carelessly from one hook rested a ring of forgotten keys. Ethan exchanged one quiet look with Margaret. I probably should not, he said softly. Margaret smiled sadly. Sometimes doing the right thing arrives wearing the wrong rules. Ethan tried the smallest key first. Nothing. Second key stuck. Third key clicked softly. The door opened with slow resistance. Inside sat a narrow room filled with dusty filing shelves, old wheelchairs, broken furniture, and stacks of forgotten paperwork. Cold air lingered heavier here somehow. Titan stepped inside immediately, nose low to the floor. Purposeful again. No hesitation. Ethan followed carefully. Margaret waited near the doorway wrapped in her blanket. Titan moved toward an old filing cabinet, shoved awkwardly near the back wall. One drawer partly open. The shepherd nudged it gently. Ethan crouched beside him and pulled the drawer wider. Inside sat resident folders untouched beneath dust. Transfer records, medical reports, waiting lists. But something else sat hidden beneath everything. A small box filled with unopened letters. Family mail, holiday cards, photographs, names written neatly on envelopes. Never delivered. Margaret slowly stepped closer. Her hand trembled as she picked one up. "Oh," she whispered softly. "This is mine." Ethan looked at the envelope. Postmarked almost 11 months ago. Return address from Seattle. Margaret opened it carefully. Inside sat a handwritten letter from someone named Emily Carter. Her granddaughter. Ethan watched Margaret's expression shift slowly from confusion to disbelief. "She wrote me," Margaret whispered, voice shaking now. She thought I stopped answering. Tears gathered quietly in her eyes. Another envelope slipped loose from the box. Then another. Birthday cards. Christmas photos. Messages never delivered. Titan gently rested his head against Margaret's knee. No excitement. No celebration. Just steady comfort. Ethan looked deeper inside the cabinet and found something else. Official relocation requests never submitted. Family contact forms marked incomplete though phone numbers clearly existed. Harold Jennings. Family contact available. No follow-up documented. Ethan exhaled slowly. This was bigger than poor staffing. Bigger than mistakes. Somewhere along the way, lonely people had become paperwork nobody expected anyone to question. Margaret carefully held the letter against her chest like something sacred. "She tried," she whispered softly. "Emily tried to find me." Ethan stood slowly, eyes moving between forgotten letters and faded paperwork. Outside the room, volunteers laughed softly down the hallway, while sunlight finally touched harbor pines through cold winter windows. Warmth had returned, but truth had arrived too. Titan looked once toward the doorway, then back toward Ethan as if asking the only question that mattered now. What happens next? Ethan rested one hand gently against the shepherd's neck, then looked toward Margaret, whose trembling smile somehow carried heartbreak and hope together. "I think," he said softly, "it is finally time people started coming back for each other." 3 months later, winter had finally loosened its grip on the Oregon coast, leaving behind softer mornings where fog rolled gently over the harbor and sunlight stretched farther across quiet streets. Harbor Pines Nursing Center still stood near the edge of town, though something about the place no longer felt forgotten. Windows stayed open more often now. Fresh flowers rested near the reception desk. Volunteers visited every week. People had started showing up again. Sometimes healing did not arrive all at once. Sometimes it arrived cup by cup, meal by meal, person by person, until loneliness slowly stopped feeling permanent. Ethan Hayes parked his old truck near the entrance just after sunrise. Warm coffee balanced carefully between gloved hands while Titan sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the building with steady amber eyes. The giant German shepherd had become something of a quiet legend around town. Children waved at him outside grocery stores. Fishermen kept treats near the marina for him. Harbor Pines residents waited near windows on Thursdays because they knew he would visit. Ethan smiled faintly as Titan stepped out beside him, tail moving slowly against cool spring air. "You got popular," Ethan muttered softly. Titan ignored the comment the way old companions often did. Inside Harbor Pines, laughter drifted through the common room. Not loud, just real. Margaret Bell sat near the piano now wearing a blue cardigan instead of the heavy blanket she once carried everywhere. Her cheeks looked healthier, her eyes brighter somehow. Titan walked directly toward her without hesitation and rested his head gently against her lap. Margaret smiled immediately. "There he is," she whispered warmly. "The man of the hour." Ethan laughed quietly. "I thought that was me." "You are close second," she teased gently. Then something changed in her expression. Nervous excitement. She folded a letter carefully in her lap. "Emily is coming today," she whispered softly. Ethan paused. "Your granddaughter?" Margaret nodded, eyes suddenly shining. "She has been calling every evening." Her voice trembled just slightly. "She said she never stopped trying." Ethan looked toward the window where spring sunlight moved softly across polished floors. 3 months ago, Margaret believed nobody remembered her name. Now family photographs rested beside her chair. Video calls happened weekly. Somebody had finally come back. Down the hallway, things had changed too. An outside review launched after Ethan quietly shared forgotten records with community advocates and local oversight groups. Harbor Pines received emergency staffing support. Missing communication records were restored. Families finally learned messages had never reached loved ones. Some cried. Some apologized. Some simply showed up without knowing what to say after years apart. Susan Miller still worked there, though differently now. Quieter somehow. Less distant. She stood near the hallway carrying paperwork before approaching Ethan carefully. "You were right," she admitted softly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Susan glanced toward residents gathered near breakfast tables. People stopped feeling like people. She paused. "I forgot that for a while." Ethan nodded once. No anger left anymore. Just tired understanding. Healing rarely came from punishment alone. Sometimes people needed remembering too. Titan suddenly lifted his head and moved toward the entrance doors. Tail slow, ears raised. Waiting. Margaret looked up immediately. That must be her. A moment later the doors opened gently. A woman in her 30s stepped inside carrying flowers with nervous hands. Tired eyes. Hope mixed with guilt written softly across her face. Emily Carter stopped moving the second she saw Margaret near the piano. Everything else seemed to quiet around them. Margaret stood slowly, hands trembling. "Emily." The younger woman covered her mouth immediately as tears filled her eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, then crossed the room quickly. Neither moved fast anymore, but somehow the distance disappeared anyway. They held each other for a long moment, while spring sunlight rested gently across the floor beside Titan, who sat quietly nearby, as though satisfied something long unfinished had finally settled into place. Margaret cried softly against her granddaughter's shoulder. "I thought you forgot me." Emily shook her head immediately. "Never," she whispered. "I thought you stopped answering." Ethan looked down at Titan. The shepherd sat completely calm now, tail brushing lightly against the floor. No urgency anymore. No searching. Just peace. Outside, ocean wind moved softly through trees, while spring replaced winter one quiet day at a time. Before leaving, Ethan walked toward the bench recently placed near Harbor Pines' entrance. Small brass plaque. Simple words. "No one deserves to be forgotten." Titan settled beside him beneath morning sunlight, while voices drifted warmly from inside the building. Laughter. Piano music. People returning to one another. Ethan rested one hand against the shepherd's neck. "You knew before the rest of us," he said quietly. Titan blinked slowly toward the harbor beyond town as though loyalty had never really been something worth explaining. And perhaps that was the strange miracle of kindness after all. Sometimes the world forgets people, but every now and then, someone loyal enough remembers to come back.